So who are you and what do you do?
Hi, Mitch. It's good to be with you. I actually feel weirdly existential whenever you ask that question. I'm like, who am I and what do I do? So my name is Johann Hari. I'm a British journalist and I write books. And I have a new book called Magic Pill: The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs that I've been working on for a while now.
You've been in my realm of reading, and I've been a fan of since the first days of Lost Connections and
Oh,
Chasing the Scream. Stolen Focus, as you know, is one of my most favorite books and still is, and I'm still sharing
oh,
it constantly and consistently because of the world we live in. So we're going
oh,
to
thank
dance
you.
through a lot of subjects, which I think is par for the course with you because you'll just write a book and then change topics in the next year. So I am curious because the last time we spoke was actually in mid-January 2023. And this book, Magic Pill, which is about all these new weight loss drugs, you actually jumped on board with Ozempic in that exact month. And I'm wondering, as you're dealing with this really complex issue of our focus and attention, which one of the things was diet. A lot of people misinterpret your book and think it's all about our screen addiction, but you were talking very heavily about diet and nutrition. And suddenly you jump into this world of Ozempic, weight loss drugs, and what becomes this book, Magic Pill. What is the bridge for you? What was that bridge where you thought this is the next big topic I want to tackle?
For me, every book I ever write is about a mystery I want to understand, right? Um, so the first book I ever wrote, Chasing the Scream, was about, we had a lot of addiction in my family and nothing I was doing was helping. And I wanted to figure out, how did we get here? Why is there so much addiction? What can you actually do to help? For my book about depression, lost connections, I wanted to understand, at the time I was nearly 40 and every single year I've been alive, depression and anxiety had increased in the US and Britain. I wanted to understand why and what we could do about it. So for me, it's always got to be a mystery. And for me, the mystery around these weight loss drugs became clear to me the moment I learned about them. And I remember very vividly where it happened. It was just before we last spoke. It was the winter of 2022. And it was that moment when the world was just reopening after everything we'd gone through. So for the first time in nearly 2 years, I went to a party and it was thrown by a Hollywood actor, an Oscar-winning actor. And I remember on the way there thinking, oh, this is going to be kind of interesting because I had gained a lot of weight during COVID, like most people. And I thought, they're all going to have gained loads of weight, right? Like, it's going to be fascinating to see them all having podged out a bit. And I arrived and everyone was significantly thinner. I don't just mean the actors, I mean their partners, their agents, the agents' partners, the agents' kids. Just everyone looked like their own Snapchat filter. They were like slimmer and clearer and cleaner and sharper. And I was a bit kind of thrown. And I was wandering around, on the corner of the dance floor, I bumped into a friend of mine and I said, wow, it looks like everyone really did take up Pilates during lockdown. And she laughed. And I kind of must have looked a bit disconsolate. And she said, well, it's not Pilates, right? And I just looked at her blankly. I had no idea what she was talking about. And she pulled out her phone and, typed a few things in and then showed me an Ozempic pen on her phone. And I'd never heard of these drugs. And I then learned in the next few days that there was a new generation of weight loss drugs that work in a completely new way, that deliver extremely rapid and huge weight loss. So the average person taking Ozempic, Wegovy, it's the same drug, loses 15% of their body weight in a year. The average person taking Mounjaro, which is the next generation of weight loss drugs, loses 21% of their body weight within a year. And the next generation after that, which is going to come out probably early next year, is Triple G, which causes 24% body weight loss within a year, which is only slightly below bariatric surgery. And I remember when I first learned this, even just sitting on this dance floor talking about it, feeling immediately intensely conflicted. Because on the one hand, I thought, okay, I can immediately see the benefits of this. We know the scientific evidence is sadly very clear that obesity, for most people, has a really bad effect on their health. I'm older now than my grandfather ever got to be because he died of a heart attack. My uncle died of a heart attack. My dad's had heart problems. I'm someone who's, my weight was always, throughout my adult life, has really yo-yoed between being slightly underweight and being quite obese. Um, And so I could see, wow, if we've got a drug that really can interrupt your disastrous relationship with food and secure really significant weight loss, wow, the appeal of that is obvious. But I also immediately thought, well, we've seen this story before. Miracle weight loss drug comes along, seems amazing. Every time that's ever happened before, in fact, there turns out to be some catastrophic effect of the weight loss drug that means it has to be withdrawn from the market or severely restricted. I also thought, well, we know why people gained weight. It wasn't because of some biological malfunction. It was because the entire food supply system changed. We eat food that would have been unrecognizable to our grandparents and our ancestors. Surely the solution is to fix the food supply system, not add an additional extra poison onto what we're doing. I thought, what about body positivity? What about people with eating disorders when they get hold of these drugs? So I immediately just felt super, super conflicted. I could see a strong case for them and a strong case against them. So there's the mystery, right? How do we make sense of this extraordinary new technology that's barreling towards us? 47% of Americans want to take these drugs. I thought, I need to understand this, right? So I started taking Ozempic, and I went on this big journey all over the world, from Reykjavik in Iceland to Minneapolis to Tokyo, to interview over 100 of the leading experts and other people who've been affected by these drugs, the biggest critics of the drugs, the biggest supporters of the drugs, the people who made the breakthroughs that led to the drugs. And it's a bit weird, Mitch. A year on, I know so much more than I knew. I know about a lot of detail about the benefits and risks. But if I'm honest with you, I'm still really conflicted, right? It's a really complex subject. And at every stage, when you think you've cracked it, you discover more complexity.
What's interesting about it as a subject too is, if I'm being reflective of your work and the success you've had, is there is this very interesting connection between how we're thinking, what we're doing to resolve that issue, how it's impacting society, and then suddenly these drugs, these medications, and what they do. I was thinking a lot about your previous work as I was reading Magic Pill, and wondering if this couldn't be a similar book in speaking about ketamine and all what we're seeing in that in terms of depression and anxiety and microdosing. There's this interesting component of it too, where these things that we wouldn't previously have seen as diseases or had looked to other solutions, we're suddenly finding that sometimes a pill is going to get you through it, and all of these other things. And by the way, as bad as the food industry is, every one of these topics that you've tackled has their own massive industry behind it as well. Because even if we remove the weight loss drugs, the weight loss industry in and of itself is probably a massive Everest in comparison to even just the pharma behind it. Is there some thought there that sometimes we build all of these things and don't realize that there's been so many advances in medicine that maybe a pill can make it go away?
Well, I think it's really complicated, because what we know is these pills, they're largely shots at the moment, but they're increasingly going to be pills.
Right.
They can massively reduce or reverse obesity, and that brings with it huge benefits and some really, really significant risks. I go through 12 really significant risks in the book. I think it's worth just explaining how they work, first of all, so if that's okay. So when you eat, if you ate now, you would get, after a little while, your gut would produce a hormone called GLP-1, which is just a natural signal in your body to say, Mitch, stop eating now, you've had enough, right? But natural GLP-1 is washed out of your system pretty quickly. It only stays in your system for a few minutes. What these drugs do is they inject into your body, or you swallow into your body, an artificial copy of GLP-1, but instead of lasting only a few minutes, it stays in your system for a whole week, which means it has this really weird effect when you start taking it. I mean, I remember 2 days after taking the first dose, I woke up and had this really weird feeling. I'm lying there and I'm thinking, what am I feeling? And I couldn't place it. I felt a little bit nauseous, which is a very common side effect, but that isn't it. I could identify that. It was something else. And I suddenly realized I had woken up and I was not hungry. Every other morning, literally of my life that I can remember, I would be woken up feeling ravenously hungry, right? Often I'd be woken up by my stomach rumbling. And I wasn't hungry. And I went to the cafe that I go to when I'm here in London, just around the corner from my apartment. And I ordered what I used to always order for breakfast, which was a large brown roll with lots of chicken and mayo in it. And she put it in front of me, Tatiana, the lovely woman who runs it, put it in front of me. And I had like 3 mouthfuls and I just didn't want any more. I was like, this is really right. I remember when I left, Tatiana yelled after me, "Are you okay?" Because she thought I was sick because I hadn't eaten the food. And then for lunch that day, I went to the Turkish restaurant that's next to my office. I used to go to all the time. Again, I ordered my standard lunch, a Mediterranean lamb, and I had a few mouthfuls. I just didn't want any more. And that night, I went to, again, I just couldn't eat it. And so it was like the shutters had come down on my appetite, and I was like 80% less hungry than I normally am. It was very just bizarre, right? So of course I lost a huge amount of weight, and we know. So this is, I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about the negatives here. The positives, and it's really important to stress the positives as well. We know what reversing obesity does for health. So the best comparison point we have, because it's extremely hard to lose weight through dieting, although some people can do it. I'm sure we'll come back to that. But the best comparison point we have is bariatric surgery, right? So, people know people who've been very, very severely overweight will have operations on their stomach to reduce their weight. And so that's the best kind of comparison point we have. And what happens to people's health after bariatric surgery? Now, it's a really grueling and a very unpleasant form of surgery, and 1 in 1,000 people die in the surgery. So there's a lot of drawbacks to it. But because you then reverse your obesity, I mean, the outcomes are absolutely extraordinary. You are 56% less likely to die of a heart attack in the next 7 years. You are 60% less likely to die of cancer in the next 7 years. You are 92% less likely to die of diabetes-related causes in the next 7 years. In fact, it's so good for your health that you're 40% less likely to die of any cause at all in the next 7 years when you reverse your obesity, right? So the health benefits are enormous. We're seeing similar health benefits with these drugs. Bear in mind, obviously, those figures, obviously, by definition, if you're having bariatric surgery, you were severely obese. Otherwise, they wouldn't let you have it. But in most cases, we know that with these weight loss drugs, the best study we now have, over 5 years, you are 20% less likely to have a heart attack and 20% less likely to have a stroke, which obviously I thought about a lot because of the heart disease problems in my family. So this might literally be saving my life. So the benefits are very clear. It took more digging to see the really quite significant risks.
So let's just talk about you and the moment. Going to a party in the Hollywood Hills, some things I've done as well. There's an aesthetic, there's a vibe. Some people get sucked into it and love it. Other people can take the distance of it. I think about Douglas Rushkoff and how he writes about our inability to even read each other's emotions because of all the plastic surgery we've had. And that's why the Real Housewives is always this massive fight. I can't tell if you're smiling or if you're angry. So there's one aspect of it where we have an obesity problem that's quite significant. There's another aspect of it where we have a beautification moment happening. Plastic surgeons, my whole thing with plastic surgeons, some of my friends are plastic surgeons, I can't believe someone would put themselves through that type of pain for that increment of beauty and how that makes them feel. Unrelated to obviously health issues where you really need plastic surgery to do this. Did you think about what that line is? What is that line between I'm pudgy and not feeling great now, January, Johann, maybe April, Mitch Joel right now, to I have a weight problem I've challenged much in the same way you have, Johann, over time, to thinking, it needs to be reconciled with medication versus, is this a self-esteem thing? Is this a motivation thing? How do you see that nuance? Because that's the one I think I think there's always, I wouldn't call them edge cases where you're morbidly obese and this is something that might genuinely save you and the risks outweigh the benefits. Anytime you go under any of these procedures, there's risks to it. Botox, whatever it might be has inherent risks. I'm sure Botox isn't 100% safe for everybody. What is it about us that is willing to take this, what I would call an extreme measure? Or are we recognizing through the development of this biopharmaceutical that there really is a way to not put all this immense pressure and stress on us.
I mean, one of the things that surprised me, there's lots of things that come up in answer to your question, but one of the things that surprised me is, of course, if we picture severely obese people, the benefit risk ratio is much easier to think about because the risk of being severely obese is so great. Actually, one of the things that really sobered me was just looking at the health risks of being overweight, not just obese, but overweight.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really sobering, right? 70% of people in the United States are overweight or obese. And things that I'm ashamed to say that I thought of as pretty trivial can have catastrophic effects on your health. So just being overweight makes you much more likely to get diabetes, for example. And I thought, oh, diabetes, that's bad. But if you're in a country with a good healthcare system and you get insulin, like Canadians and British people, you're basically the same as everyone else, right? When I discussed this with doctors, they were like, no, no, no. That is not the case at all. If you are diabetic when you're 18, it knocks on average 15 years off your life, and you are much more likely to go blind, to have a limb amputated. In fact, more people have a limb amputated in the United States or an extremity amputated as a result of diabetes than from being shot, right? And you think about how many people get shot in the US, that's staggering. The effects of diabetes are just devastating. In fact, one of the most well-known doctors in Britain, Dr. Max Pemberton, said something to me that sounds very shocking when you first hear it. But then he talked through the reasoning. He said, if you gave me a choice as a doctor between becoming diabetic and becoming HIV positive, I would choose to become HIV positive. Because if you're HIV positive and you get healthcare, you live as long as everyone else. If you're diabetic, even if you get healthcare, it has devastating effects on you. And even being overweight significantly increases your risk of being diabetic. So, of course, severe obesity is many magnitudes greater risk to health. But so that's the first thing I thought as you said that, is that actually you can kind of go, oh, well, you're talking about them, but people like me, that doesn't apply to, right? And I was never severely obese. My worst BMI, or highest BMI would have been, I think, 32 or 33. So high, but it's certainly not severe obesity. You're totally right that there's a whole other thing going on at the same time as all of this, which is there's the health conversation. And then there's, I spent a lot of time discussing this with my friend Elise Lonan, who used to be the chief content editor for Goop, Gwyneth Paltrow's lifestyle brand, and then quit. She doesn't criticize her former employer, but she's become a very articulate critic of that wider way of thinking. And she says to me, she won't even go out for dinner with people in Hollywood anymore because no one eats anything. She's like, why the fuck are we out for dinner? None of you are eating anything, right? The way she put it is, dieting is out, elimination is in. And no one who was at that party, or almost no one at that party, would have been obese at the start, right? So at the same time as you've got a lot of people taking these drugs who started obese, who are trying to come down to a healthy weight, you've also got a lot of people who started at a healthy weight, or actually started at pretty slim, who are taking it to become super skinny. And we know that has disastrous effects. When it has disastrous effects for their health that we can go into in terms of muscle mass, many other things, they're really storing up health problems for themselves later in life. We also know that has a disastrous effect on the culture. We know, the worst moment for me in the whole writing of the book was a moment that happened. It must have been about 6 months into writing the book. So I've got a niece called Erin, who's she's now 19, but she's the baby of my family. In my head, she's always 6 years old. So I'm very protective of her. She's the only girl in her generation, and the youngest. And one day I was chatting to her on FaceTime, and she was like, "Wow, you've lost so much weight. I didn't know you had a jaw until now." And I was like preening a little bit, and suddenly she looked down at her own body. She's always been a kind of normal, healthy weight. And she said, "Will you get me some Ozempic?" And I thought she was laughing, joking, so I laughed. And then I realized she was serious, and I thought, oh, fuck, what am I doing? All her life I've been trying to give her these messages. Don't be judged on how you look, embrace your body, aim to be healthy, not to be skinny. Then I thought, oh, shit, am I counteracted everything I ever told her? And if that's true of me, my God, that's true of all these Hollywood stars who she's seen suddenly shrinking. So yeah, at the same time as there's a very important health debate where we need to carefully weigh the benefits and risks, there are really significant benefits, there are really significant risks. Everyone will have to weigh them for themselves. We also need to have a different conversation. Obviously, there's some overlap, but a different conversation about people taking it not to be a healthy weight, but to be an unhealthy weight in the other direction. And that's obviously most acutely the case with people with eating disorders, which is one of my really big worries about these drugs. I mean, you can amputate your appetite using these drugs. We were already having a huge explosion in eating disorders, well, before COVID, but then they shot up hugely in lockdown. So yeah, I'm very, very worried about that. And most importantly, the eating disorders experts I interviewed are really worried about that as well.
But there's also this medical pharma complex. I guess that's where I'm most curious or concerned about. That I don't think after the work you've done with depression, anxiety, and psychology that you would say if you're feeling a little down for a couple of days, you should probably be on an antidepressant or take
Sure.
some type of Xanax. It doesn't feel like we're diagnosing, using air quotes, what it means to be a, a profile for this drug. It feels like the real reins of regulation need to step in there so that we don't make these addictive type disasters again. This is the whole Prozac Nation concern. This is the whole ADHD medication stuff you talked about in Stolen Focus that I took really seriously in terms of, wow, we have a crisis on our hands. This seems like a crisis of magnitude that would trample that because we're not really identifying who would qualify for this type of thing. We're just doling it out.
Well, yes. One of the things I really agonized about writing the book and had a series of epiphanies about were in relation to this question of seeking pharmaceutical solutions to societal problems, right?
Right.
So we know why we've got an obesity crisis. I mean, it's really important to understand how incredibly recent the obesity crisis is, right? The average American now weighs 23 pounds more than the average American did in 1960. That is a staggering increase. Between the year I was born, 1979, and the year I turned 21, obesity more than doubled in the United States, right? That is unprecedented in the whole of human history. There's never been a society where that happened before or anything like it, right? And in fact, in the whole world, obesity has tripled according to the World Health Organization since 1975 and is set to rise even more. And we know why it happened. It happens in every society that makes a specific change, that moves from predominantly eating freshly cooked whole foods to eating mostly processed and ultra processed foods, right?
Exactly.
The average American child now, 78% of their diet, 78% of the calories they get every day comes from ultra processed food, which means food that is assembled in a factory that your grandparents would not have recognized as food. And we know what that food does to us. I go through it in detail in the book, but there's an experiment that really distills it for me. There's a guy called Professor Paul Kenny, who's the head of neuroscience at Mount Sinai, a brilliant scientist, who he moved to the United States when he was in his 20s to finish his PhD. And he moved from Dublin, where he was from, he's Irish, to San Diego. And he quickly noticed, wow, Americans don't eat like Irish people. They eat much more processed food, much more ultra processed food, much more fat, sugar. And like all good immigrants, he kind of assimilated, right? And within a year, he'd gained something like 30 pounds. And he started to notice that the more you eat this food, the more you crave it. And he began to wonder, does this food affect your brain in some way? So he designed an experiment that discovered something really important. I've nicknamed it Cheesecake Park. That's not its official title.
Yeah, it's great.
So what you do, you get a load of rats. He raises a load of rats in a cage. And all they've got is the kind of food that they evolved over many thousands of years to eat. They've got pellets based on whole foods, right? If you give the rats far more pellets than they could ever possibly eat of their natural whole food, they'll eat when they're hungry and then they'll stop. Given their natural food stuff, the kind of thing they evolved to eat, they never became obese, right? They had some kind of natural nutritional wisdom that made them go, I've had enough now, let's stop. Then he introduced the American diet to them. He fried up some bacon, he bought them some Snickers bars, crucially, he got them a load of cheesecake. And he put it in the cage, and they still had all the old healthy food as well. And they just blipped for it. They would hurl themselves into the cheesecake and eat their way out and emerge sort of slicked with cheesecake all over their whiskers. And they would just eat and eat and eat and eat and not stop. right? As he put it to me, within a couple of days, they were different animals. All sorts of health indicators were going wrong. They rapidly became extremely obese. So when they had the kind of food they evolved to eat over thousands of years, they didn't make themselves obese. They knew when to stop. When they had this new kind of food, their ability to stop just seemed to disappear, and they gorged themselves and rapidly became very overweight. Then Professor Kenny did a little twist, which as a former junk food addict myself seemed to me a little bit cruel. He took away all the American food and they just had the healthy pellets again. And he was pretty sure he knew what would happen. They would eat more of the pellets than they did before, and this would prove that access to junk food expands your appetite and the amount of calories you eat. That's not what happened. What happened was something more freaky. The rats refused to eat at all. Once they got addicted to the American food, it was like they didn't recognize the whole food as food at all anymore. And it was really only until when they were starving that they eventually went back to eating it. And this fits with a much wider body of evidence. People like Professor Gerald Mand, who designed the nutritional label that's on all food in the United States, said to me, there's something about the food we're eating that is undermining our ability to stop, right? By the way, Paul Kenny, the Cheesecake Park guy, could never eat cheesecake again after that experiment. He was like, he would just picture the rats like emerging from it, like gorged. But
like a
and we know
3-year-old
what
and
it
a
is.
birthday cake, yeah.
but one of the things that I was thinking about when I learned that is exactly related to what you're asking, Mitch. Okay, so we know what's causing the problem, right? The way Michael Lowe, who's a brilliant professor at Drexel University in Philly, put it to me, is Ozempic is an artificial solution to an artificial problem. So processed and ultra-processed food undermined our ability to stop eating and our ability to feel, and it's a very important concept here, satiety, the feeling of having had enough, right? It chronically undermines it. I go through the 7 ways it chronically undermines it in the book. And what these drugs do is give us back our sense of satiety, right? They give you back in fact, one of the scientists who developed them, Dr. Carel LaRousse, describes them as giving you satiety hormones, right? And when I heard that, I thought the thing that's kind of implicit in your question, which is, well, this is crazy. Why am I taking a drug to solve a social problem? We should deal with the social problem. We need to change the food supply system. And indeed, I went to places that had done this, like Japan. And I went to one of my closest friends. I call her Judy in the book. And she'd had cancer 7 years before, 8 years before, I think. And it was horrendous. She's a single mother. She nearly died. It was awful. And thank God she made a full recovery. And I was with her all through that process, the chemo and everything. And she said to me, something's really wrong with Britain and the US about breast cancer. Something in the environment is causing breast cancer. 1 in 7 women in Britain get breast cancer, 1 in 8 women in the United States. That's not happening in other countries like Japan. It's 1 in 38 women. It didn't happen in the past. Something is causing breast cancer, right? And we absolutely need to figure out what that is and deal with it. But she said to me, but when I got breast cancer, you didn't say to me, well, fuck this. The environment caused your breast cancer and now you're injecting yourself with a whole other set of poisons. We've got to deal with the social causes of cancer. You said, well, obviously we've got to deal with the social causes of cancer, but we've also got to make sure that you survive now, right? And she said to me, it's like if your house is on fire, you can make a very strong case to say, we should build houses out of less flammable materials, and we should make sure that every house has sprinklers in it. That's a really good idea, but you still need to call the damn fire brigade, right? And it made me realize, oh yeah, like, we've got to deal with the social causes of this problem, but I've also got to stay alive, right? And it's complicated because, of course, seeming to solve it with a drug can drain the support for dealing with the social problem, right? That is my big worry. But equally, what am I meant to do? Just die of a heart attack to prove the point? I mean, I support gun control, but if you're shot in front of me, I'm not gonna say, well, we needed to ban the bump stocks that shot Mitch.
Right.
I'm gonna say, let's get a doctor to put him back together, and then we'll fight to ban the bump stocks that shot him and ban the gun show loophole and everything else. So I found that quite a powerful argument, and it did make me persuaded that it is possible and indeed necessary to deal with the social causes, but also we need to live in the world we currently live in, and we need to stay alive in that world as well.
So tell me what happens, Johann. You take the first injection. Is it an immediate effect by the next day? What happens after months and months if you stop taking it? Is your brain rewired that you can use willpower and all those tools that you knew were the better of your angels to push through? When you're on it, is it you have to stay on it forever? At what point do you have to maybe get off of it because you're losing too much weight? What was that like for your journey?
Yeah, so everyone starts at a low dose. You start on 0.25 milligrams because otherwise the side effects become too big too quickly. So most people experience nausea. I got that mildly. Most people, the nausea goes away. Um, for me, actually, the most onerous side effect was for a significant minority of people, it elevates their heartbeat,
Ah,
which can make you feel anxious because if your heart is
sure.
racing, you just sort of your body naturally interprets that as anxiety. That was for me the most onerous and unpleasant thing. But you go to a load of really important questions which lead us to many of the risks associated with these drugs, some of which I experienced.
Yeah.
Um, so if you stop, for the vast majority of people, you just regain the weight within a year. So it's like statins or like blood pressure medication. It's not solving the problem, it's treating a chronic ongoing situation. And when you stop, if you take statins and then you stop, your heart problems will go back to the level of risk you experienced before. Your cholesterol levels will go back to what they were
Now,
before.
before we jump on, tell me why that is. I would think this is different because your body's adjusting. You're probably exercising more. You're probably eating in a different way. Your mind is also shifting. I'm assuming its position on how it does things. Why does that happen? I would think that if you are using them and your habits have changed, that's going to be a part of the opportunity here.
It's a really important question, and the answer is we don't know. I mean, one of the
Ah,
fascinating
okay.
things about these drugs is there's so much we don't know, right? We don't know the primary mechanism by which they work. I explained the effects in the gut with GLP-1, but actually there's increasing evidence that it also has a huge effect on your brain. Probably the predominant effect is on your brain. We don't know. There's a huge debate about what that is. There's many different theories about what it's doing to your brain that I go through in the book. We don't know. Um, and that question about why, of course, everyone's habits change when they take these drugs. You can't eat the way you did before, which brings with it plenty of challenges, as well as obviously benefits. So why can't you just, why doesn't the change stick? I think it's probably, and I want to stress this is speculative, but it's probably linked to a parallel body of science, which is the key to understanding why diets, for the vast majority of people who try them, don't work. So I found this quite challenging because, I've had plenty of times in my life when I went on a diet and lost weight, right? And 17% of people are dieting at any given time. So I'm sure lots of people listening know this feeling, right?
Right.
And we all know the science of it. It's really simple. If you burn more calories than you consume, you lose weight, right? To dispute that, you have to dispute the laws of physics. So it seems obvious. Diets work, eat less, exercise more, use willpower, boom. And we've all been doing that for a really long time, and we've been getting fatter and fatter. So something is not right here, and I want to understand it. I went to interview a person I think has done the most important and revealing research on diet in the world, a brilliant woman called Professor Tracy Mann, who's at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. It's funny, I interviewed her in a brilliant bakery called Isles Bun. It's kind of famous Minneapolis bakery. And when you walk through the door, the first thing that happens is they say to you, "Have you been here before?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Oh, here's a free cinnamon bun." And they gave me this like 2,000 calorie cinnamon bun that
Right.
sat there
Yeah.
throughout our entire conversation about why diets don't work. But so Professor Mann began to research this in the year 2000, and she was intrigued by something because at that time, pretty much all the scientific research was clear: diets work, right? If you diet, you lose weight. But she started looking at the studies and she noticed something, which is that almost all of these studies follow people for 3 months, some of them for 6 months. So what they do is you go on a diet, you eat less and exercise more for 3 months, and of course you lose weight, and then the study stops, and the implication is that you just carry on at that lower weight forever, right? But Professor Mann thought, well, that doesn't seem to be what happens with most people. Let's look at this a bit more. And she started looking for studies that had followed people not over 3 months or 6 months, but over dieters over a longer period of time. And at that time, there were, I think, 24 studies that had ever been done of people who dieted for 2 years or 5 years. It was a handful for 5 years. And the results are very different when you look at the longer term. People on a diet, 2 years on, the average weight loss is 2 pounds, which is almost nothing. Now, that's an average. There is a significant minority who do lose a lot of weight and keep it off. We all know people like that. I've got one in my own family. But that's really unusual, right? The vast majority of people don't lose weight over the medium to long term on diets. And you can think, well, how can that be, right? And lots of scientists have explained kind of why, which is that as you become obese, a whole series of biological changes take place that make it harder to go back. So one of the best ways to understand this is in the 60s and 70s, it was thought that your weight was sort of preset at birth, that you had what was called a set point in your body that sort of determines your weight. And you can go a little bit above it or a little bit below it, but not much.
It plays
right?
into body type too. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. The best analogy would be with body temperature, right? So
Right.
your body everyone knows that your body wants to be a certain temperature. If you go higher than that temperature, you'll start sweating and desperately seeking shade. And if you go below that temperature, you'll start shivering, which brings your body temperature up. So your body has your body innately fixes you at a certain temperature. And if you go outside that zone, it will work really hard to bring you back within that zone, completely involuntarily. If you get too hot, you can't stop yourself sweating, right? Or if you get too cold, you can't stop yourself shivering. And it was thought for a long time, well, just like we've got a temperature set point, we've got a weight set point. But then in the late 70s and then throughout the 80s right up to the present, the obesity crisis happened. And scientists at first were like, oh, well, that just theory was wrong, right? Because here we are, everyone's gaining so much weight, that's not possible, right? If we have an innate set point. But actually what they discovered, people like Professor Michael Lowe, who I mentioned before at Drexel, discovered what they argued is, you do have a biological set point, but as your weight rises, your biological set point rises. So let's say that you gained, 50 pounds in the next 2 years. Your body would then take your 50-pound higher weight as its natural fixed weight. And when you tried to lose weight, the equivalent of shivering and sweating would kick in to hold you at that higher weight. And we know the evidence for these mechanisms is very strong. Your metabolism would slow down, so you'd burn calories more slowly. You'd be more lethargic, so you'd want to exercise less. You would crave more sweet and sugary foods. And you would actually attentionally, because of your brain, you would notice fatty and sugary foods more. And at first, when I learned this, and the evidence for it is very clear and I think persuasive, but kept saying to the scientists, but why would we have that? Why would evolution endow us with something that is so bad for us? And we don't know, but the most plausible theory is you have to think about the circumstances where human beings evolved. In the circumstances where human beings evolved, there was never a time when the danger was that you would have an excess abundance of calories all around you forever. That just never happened, right? The danger was something else. The danger was famine. Famine was a constant threat during our evolution. Well, not constant, but a frequent threat during our evolution. And in a famine, where there's a famine might come tomorrow, there's a huge advantage to you being fat, right? In a famine, Timothy Chalamet will die in week 1, and me at my fattest will still be alive 2 months later, right?
Right.
A huge advantage in a situation where famine periodically occurs to whenever you can fatten up because it ain't going to last long, right? But of course, now our bodies are preparing us for a famine that is never going to come and encouraging us to fatten and fatten and fatten ourselves. And it makes it very hard to reverse obesity. Now, I think there's a strong case that those biological mechanisms are in place. We know they are extremely strong. And I suspect what happens is when you stop taking these drugs, those biological mechanisms are reasserting themselves. But the truth is we don't know.
Yeah. I'm curious how you reconcile this part of the discovery, this obesity challenge, this food industry, our craving for sugar. This is not something new. I'm thinking about Super Size Me documentaries that were demonstrating in very clear color what happens when we don't pay attention to that. And I converse this in a world where it feels to me like we've never spoken more about wellness and health and what it means to eat and what food should be, that our access to information is staggering. I'm thinking about some of the biggest podcasts in the world that even focus on bro culture, talk about everything from pickleball to any type of new type of working out to supplements. It seems like it's everywhere. And even as somebody who will hit January of a new year and think, well, what can I do differently in my New Year's resolutions? You're almost paralyzed by the options of diets, from paleo to carnivore to types of workouts you can do, to how you could do it on an app, to our watches, to our monitoring. Why hasn't that side of it shifted the tide even a little bit? Why do you think we're still sliding down this when so much more information is available to us? It feels like it's not that moment when everybody's smoking and then we discover, oh, this isn't good for you. That information is plain. It's in our sight every day. You can't watch a piece of content without someone talking about wellness, well-being, companies giving food and what they're doing, and bringing in chefs. Why hasn't that had any impact?
The way I think of that stuff is it's like an umbrella in a storm, right? So
Really? Okay.
you've got to picture all that stuff you're talking about and the willpower we exert in order to follow the advice. Is like an umbrella we hold over ourselves, right? And some people, it gets the umbrella gets them to where they want to go, dry and well. There's plenty of people who are well in this society. But you've got to picture it as a hurricane of stuff flowing the other way, right? More 3-year-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name. Ronald McDonald is the second most recognized figure in the whole world after Santa Claus. Dunkin' Donuts sells enough donuts every day to circle the entire planet twice. The food companies spend more than $1 billion promoting ultra-processed food to children every year, right?
But even they have shifted menu items. We see the caloric intake on them. My favorite thing is to go to the Cheesecake Factory and realize that a hamburger is much less calories than a salad. It's one of my favorite things in the world to do. There are other options, even in terms of the fastest growing types of new fast food and even regular restaurants. I mean, it is a time where we're not seeing where yes, I would agree with the theory, but in terms of the practice, it feels like there's never been as much opposing information as well at the same time. Would you?
Well, but you have to think about, is information what drives behavior, right?
Right.
And information helps, but we know human beings are not purely rational creatures who make assessments based on behavior, based on information. And actually, it's interesting to think about that. As you say that, I'm thinking about one of the effects of these drugs on me, which I think helps us to understand why we're not just assessing the information of these drugs or of the food. So I had this weird experience that quite a lot of people, a significant minority of people, are having. So I was losing, obviously I lost a huge amount of weight. I lost 3 stone on these drugs. And I remember thinking, for at least the first 6 months, I'm getting what I want, and I don't feel any better. In fact, I felt slightly worse. My emotions were a bit muted. I don't want to overstate it. I wasn't depressed or anything, but my emotions felt quite muted, and I was a bit puzzled by it. And of course, it could just be a coincidence in my own case, but we know, so there have been concerns raised by doctors. It's been what's called a safety signal that's been raised, and it's being investigated about the possibility of these drugs for some people cause depression or even suicide. There's a warning. The FDA requires a warning on the on the drugs in the US, although the European Medicines Agency has not been persuaded by that evidence. And I think there's lots of things going on there. There may be actual brain effects, and I go through why in the book, but I suspect the most significant thing in that is I go through in the book the 5 reasons why we eat. So before I started doing the research, if you'd asked me why do you eat, I would have said, well, I eat to sustain my body, right? Obviously. But a year and a half ago, I was eating 3,200 calories a day, and now I eat about 1,800 calories a day. So that's a lot of calories that were doing something else, because here I am, my body is sustained. In fact, it's significantly healthier. What were they doing? And one of them, I go through lots of them in the book, but one of them is food is a great source of comfort, psychological comfort.
Emotional eating, for sure.
100%. And we know there's lots of evidence for emotional eating and comfort eating. And one of the things that happens is these drugs take away your ability to comfort eat, right? You can't. I mean, I remember I had a day, probably about 6 months into reading the book. Sorry, it's about 6 months into writing the book where I was in Vegas. As you know, I'm writing a book about a series of crimes that have been happening in Vegas. I've been researching it a long time, and I was there because I was investigating a dreadful thing that had happened. So it was a rough day, right? And I almost really on autopilot, I went to the KFC on West Sahara, which is one of the skeeziest KFCs in the world, and that's saying something. And
you can do better than that, Johann. Yeah,
exactly. And just really on autopilot, I ordered what I would have ordered like a year before, right? Like a bucket of chicken. I sat there and I looked at it, and I thought, I can't eat this. Oh, I'm just going to have to feel my feelings. So, and I remember Colonel Sanders was on the wall, kind of staring down at me as if he was saying, hey, what happened to my best customer, right? So when you think about implicit in your question, perfectly reasonably is, okay, we're making these decisions to eat X over Y. Well, I know X will be worse for my health than Y. Why am I not choosing Y? Well, partly it's because we're not just eating to make rational decisions about our health. We're eating to manage our emotions. We're eating for pleasure. We're eating to reenact childhood patterns. We're eating to protect ourselves. There's a whole range of complex reasons. We're eating in an environment that has made us like those rats in Cheesecake Park, absolutely addicted and primed for that food and unable to recognize healthy food as food in many cases. So there's a whole complex array of things that are happening in this culture from the moment we're born, actually, that block out. It's not that rational calculation is nothing. That's part of everyone to some degree, but it's one force competing with many, many other forces in a highly complex combat, really.
I feel silly for having not asked this when we were talking about what's happening with, let's use you as the example here. Are you still eating the same, we'll call them in air quotes, bad foods, just less of them? Or has the loss of weight and the loss of appetite given you the time when you're sitting with your feelings to think about, I can have this salad with chicken and put something crunchy in there to satiate, that feeling of wanting chips or whatever it might be. What can you walk me through how you eat now and why it's still effective beyond, because if it's just a drug, you would think, well, I could just eat as much as I want.
Well, you definitely can't eat as much as you want. It would be very, I mean, you can't do that. I mean, if you tried to, you would vomit, I suspect. Like, I mean, there's a very small number of people for whom the drug doesn't actually seem to work.
Obviously, for sure.
But
it's working for you. I'm curious what you eat and how you think about food now differently than before.
Yeah. So it's a really important question. So for the first 6 months, I was eating smaller portions of the same old shit, right? So, I would, well, like that cafe I went to, I would have like a third of the chicken and mayo roll, not the whole thing. And I spoke to this really interesting guy called Professor Robert Wilding, who's been involved in, I'm sorry, I've said his name wrong. I spoke to a guy called Professor Robert Kushner, who's been involved in a lot of the key clinical trials around these drugs. And I said this to him. He's also a doctor who treats people. Although I was interviewing him, I wasn't seeing him in a medical capacity. And I said, I'm...
free advice is free advice, Johann. We're not going to turn it down.
And I was like, yeah, I'm just eating the same portions of shit. The same smaller portions of the same shit. And he said, well, look, that's obviously better, right? But it's not good, because we know that even independent of weight, nutrition is really important.
Right.
And if you're eating food that doesn't give you good nutrition, that's going to cause all sorts of problems. We know that poor nutrition leads to a massive rise in all sorts of disease risks. And it was really challenging, because I sort of realised, so I've had my capacity to comfort eat taken away. I've had my eating patterns disrupted, but I'm still sort of trying to dig in the same little narrow hole. And I'm embarrassed to say I was in my mid-40s and I didn't know how to cook. I'd never really cooked anything. And I learned to cook. And especially I went to Japan, because Japan I think is really important for the obesity debate, for reasons we can talk about. But I started eating a lot of Japanese food, which is delicious and filling, weirdly, because it is the kind of food that gives you satiety, not the kind of food we eat, which drains your satiety and leaves you feeling like you've got a hole in your stomach. So it took there's a long lag between me starting the Ozempic and it leading to those changes. But I'm pretty confident I would not have made those changes had it not been for the drug. Now, I could have. You could say that to me and you'd be absolutely right. Of course, if Ozempic had never been invented, I could have started eating Japanese food a year before, but I don't think I would have. I think it took the radical interruption and the insights that emerged from that, for me, and I'm not speaking for everyone here, obviously, for that to happen, but it was painful, right? I didn't feel good. I didn't like having that coping mechanism taken away from me. No one likes to be told that their comfort blanket is actually poisoned, right? It was very uncomfortable. And there were quite a lot of uncomfortable moments, and that was definitely one of them.
Are you exercising more or less or same as you were before?
I was actually always pretty good for exercise. Not always, but for many years now, I've actually been pretty good for exercise. I've got a personal trainer. I go really often. I walk everywhere, wherever I am. And believe me, I am the only person in Las Vegas who walks anywhere. So if you see anyone walking in Las Vegas, they're either homeless people or me. So yeah, I've always been pretty good for that, actually, for a long time now anyway. But I sort of stepped it up. One of the advantages of this is that it's easier to exercise when you're not carrying as much weight.
What makes you believe if you stopped it today that you wouldn't maintain this cooking and desire for the food you now like and the exercising, and that wouldn't be enough? What
I
gives you the
might.
fear?
It's just looking at the evidence of what other people do, right? If you look at the clinical trials, they're really clear. Most people regain the weight very rapidly, like the vast majority regain the weight pretty rapidly. There is a significant minority who don't, and maybe I would be one of them. And I think it's definitely worth thinking about that, because there are really big risks to taking these drugs. I'll give you an example. Oh shit, I've just realised I've got to plug in my laptop. Sorry, hang on 1 second. Battery. Plug it in. Yeah, sorry about that. So if we think about some of the risks, I mean, some of them are pretty chilling. I'll give you an example. So when we talk about the safety of these drugs, most of the scientists involved very reasonably say we can be quite confident of the short to medium term safety of these drugs, for a very simple reason, which is that diabetics have been taking them now for 18 years. Millions of people. We have millions of patient weeks that have been taking these drugs all over the world. So for people who don't know, in addition to having this effect on your appetite, GLP-1 agonists like these drugs also stimulate the creation of more insulin, which obviously is what diabetics need. So 18 years of diabetics taking it, they say if it caused some horrendous problem, we would have seen it in diabetics by now. Now they stress, the scientists involved stress, well, it could affect people who are taking it for obesity differently. We need to be conscious of that. But also a lot of diabetics are obese for obvious reasons. So, we've got a very good body of data. Against that, some scientists say, okay, let's look at the diabetics. Let's see how well they're doing. And one of the most chilling pieces of research, which is contested, was by a scientist I interviewed called Professor Jean-Luc Failly, who's at the University Hospital of Montpellier in France. And he was tasked by the French Medicines Agency to look at the risk profile of these drugs. And France has incredibly good medical databases, partly because they don't really have the HIPAA rules, so they don't have, you can't really opt out of them very easily. So they've got incredibly good medical databases. So what Professor Faye and his team did is they look at two groups. They look at diabetics who took these drugs for 3 years or more between 2006 and I think 2016. And then they compare them to a representative group of diabetics who were very similar but did not take the drugs. And what they found was that the category who had taken the drugs, these drugs appeared to increase their thyroid cancer risk by between 50 and 75%. Now, the reason they were looking at thyroid cancer is because we know in animal studies, if you give rats these drugs, it really significantly increases their thyroid cancer risk. Now, it's important to understand what that doesn't mean. That doesn't mean 50 to 75% of people who take the drug get thyroid cancer. If it did, obviously they'd be immediately taken off the market. What it means is, whatever your thyroid cancer risk was at the start, if this research is right, that risk will increase by between 50 to 75%. Now, it remains an overall low risk. 1.2% of people get thyroid cancer, 84% of them survive it. So it's a big increase in a relatively small risk, which means the overall risk remains low. Nonetheless, when I heard that, I said to Professor Faye, well, that's pretty shocking. And he said, yeah, it's not a small increase, right? Now, the European Medicines Agency has not yet been persuaded of this research, although the FDA in the US does warn people who have thyroid cancer in their family not to take these drugs. Against that, and it's one of the things with the risk here, you've got to always be weighing the risk of these drugs against the risk of ongoing obesity. And lots of people reasonably point out, obesity massively increases your cancer risk, right? Massively. It's one of the most shocking facts about obesity is Cancer Research UK, the main British charity, explains when you carry excess fat, it doesn't just sit there, it's not inert. It sends signals through your body, and one of the signals it can send is for cells to divide more rapidly, which causes cancer. So you've got to weigh even that increased thyroid cancer risk, which is chilling, against, well, okay, the risk of, for me, if the alternative would have been continuing to be obese, what cancer risk is there? So at every turn, you've got these complex calculations, and anyone who's telling you about these drugs, either rah, they're the best thing in the world, nothing to worry about here, take it, or the people who are saying, oh, this is the devil's drug, it's terrible, don't take it, I don't think they're attending to the sort of complex grey ambiguity in the middle. Now, it's possible we will discover some catastrophic effect from these drugs. That has happened with previous diet drugs, including the most popular recent diet drug in the 90s, fen-phen, which we can talk about if you like.
Yeah.
And there are certainly all sorts of risks that we already know about that are really significant. There are also, and perhaps this is the thing that most worries me, and one of the people who talked about this most interestingly was a guy called Greg Stanwood, who's a brilliant scientist researching these drugs at Florida State. One of the biggest worries, given how long people have to take these drugs, is what, to borrow a phrase from Donald Rumsfeld, is kind of the unknown unknowns, right? So a good example that Dr. Stanwood gave, I want to stress he wasn't saying these drugs will have this effect. He was saying this is an analogy to help us understand this risk. Think about antipsychotics. So in the 1950s, scientists started prescribing antipsychotics and they judged them to be safe. Fast forward 50 years, and people who'd been taking antipsychotics for a long time, it was discovered were dramatically more likely to get Alzheimer's disease and dementia more generally. Now, you just couldn't have known that at the start. It was an unknown unknown in the 1950s. You couldn't possibly have known that, but we now know it, right? Similarly, we don't know the long-term effect of taking these drugs. We've got 18 years. That's not nothing. But, we currently have a big debate about whether kids should be given them. Novo Nordisk is doing trials of giving these drugs to 6-year-old children. These are people who could be taking these drugs for 80 years, right? What do we know about the long-term effects of it? Nothing. We know that these drugs, the cutting-edge research, and I interviewed lots of the neuroscientists who are working on this, is that these drugs probably primarily work on your brain, as I mentioned before. They're chronically activating parts of the brain that are really important, that relate to memory, gut motility, autonomic processing, all sorts of things that are really important. So you're right to say, implicit in your question is, well, shouldn't you try stopping taking them and see,
What
see if
happens?
I can do this now without it? Yeah, I probably should. I mean, I have made the decision. Everyone is going to have to make a calculation of risk for themselves, and I think everyone reading Magic Pill will probably make a different calculation. So I would say, probably broadly, if your BMI is below 27, you should not take these drugs. The risks are great, and you're not obese, so you don't get any of those benefits of losing obesity. If your BMI is higher than 35, I think it's a pretty strong case for taking the drugs, provided you don't have thyroid cancer in your family and you're not trying to get pregnant. That's a whole other set of risks we can talk about. If you're between 27 and 35, I think it's a much more ambiguous and complex calculation, and different people will reach different conclusions. But it's got. I always think about something that a wonderful woman called Dr. Shauna Levy, who's at Tulane Medical School in New Orleans, said to me, "We don't know the long-term risks of these drugs. We do know the long-term risks of obesity, and they are really bad.
Yeah.
So we've got to be constantly making this calculation."
I want to be respectful of your time. Just two more questions. One is, tell me about Japan and the Japanese. And I have to admit that in reading the book and thinking about it, I had those laughs of the French woman's diet and the Scarsdale diet and these regions where the blue zones, and we could go on and on. What is going on in Japan, and what makes you believe that it isn't one of those fads in and of itself, that we need to look at these types of people or those types of people or a city?
Well, Japan is the only country in the world that got rich without getting fat. 42.5% of Americans are obese, 70% are obese or overweight. In Japan, 4.5% of people are obese, right? So it's a tenth of the American obesity rate, and it's projected to actually fall, even without these drugs. In fact, there's almost no market for these drugs in Japan because there's almost no obese people. It's really weird that we have a mental picture of Japan. When we think of it, we think of sumo wrestlers, because that's like expecting an American to look like a bald eagle, right? Like they're just,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
and so I want to understand, how do they do it, right? We know it's not genetic because Japanese Hawaiians, so Japanese people who moved to Hawaii in the late 19th century, are almost as obese as other Hawaiians. I was just in Hawaii and saw that for myself. So and it's not that their genes suddenly mutated in that 100 years. We know there's something going on in Japan, in the environment, that is keeping people's weight down. And we also know that it's quite a recent change. This fascinated me. This guy called Professor Bharat Kushner at the University of Cambridge, professor of East Asian history, who's shown, as recently as the 1920s, Japanese people had one of the worst diets in the world. They ate almost no protein. They only ate fish once a week. And it was very consciously the Japanese government at the time, the population was too weak to raise an army to go and invade the rest of Asia. So not a good motivation for health, to be sure, but they please don't follow. We don't want to deal with the obesity crisis to go and invade everyone else, but
Exactly.
that's not the motivator we need. But what they did was they very consciously changed Japan's diet, right? To the Japanese diet we now know, and they very consciously maintain it. Obviously, now the democratic government of Japan, I don't want to act like they're still that government, but and it was fascinating to go there and see it. So, for example, I went to a school in Tokyo called Koenji School. It takes kids from 5 to 18. Every morning, all the kids arrive on foot on their own, because all children in Japan walk to school on their own from the age of 5. So they get a lot of exercise walking there and back. And you arrive, and the first person who greeted us at the gate, me and my translator, was the school's nutritionist, a woman called Harumi Tatibe. Every school has to employ a nutritionist. It's a serious qualification, takes 3 years to get. And it's your job as the nutritionist to design all the food for the school. All food served to children in Japanese schools has to be freshly made on the day. No processed or ultra-processed food is allowed. Even the paste on the food has to be freshly made on the day. No, kids are not allowed to bring packed lunches. You have to eat the food at the school. And they use this healthy food to educate the children in how to eat more healthily, right? What it is to be healthy. So they do loads of things like that in Japan that help the kids learn to be healthy. They have loads of measures in place. that make the society and the culture healthy. There's dozens of steps that I go through. And, if Japan can do it, we can do it. And I know that sounds very remote, but, think about smoking, right? In 1987, more than half of Americans smoked. Today, I think the figure is 11%, much lower for young people. I know we've got an issue with vaping, but that is less bad than cigarette smoking. That's an enormous public health transformation in a very fast period of time. We can make the same transformation with food if we want to. I go through in the book how we could do it. I went to places that have begun that, from Mexico to the Netherlands. We can do these things if we want to. And we absolutely should. We should not be trapped with the choice between, being obese and just everyone being on these weight loss drugs 40, 50 years from now. We can change the culture now, as Japan did, to rescue our kids from facing these competing risks.
I'm thinking about all the crazy stories and memes that were created out of the state of New York when they even floated the idea of that tax for sugary, unhealthy processed foods, and how you could have my cold, dead Coke from my cold, dead hands is the.
But people did the same with cigarettes. You remember, we were old enough to remember, Mitch, right? Yeah. My mother smokes 70 cigarettes a day. There's a photograph of me and her when I was 6 months old. She's breastfeeding me, smoking, and resting the ashtray on my stomach, right? Smokers went crazy when we restricted smoking. Now, who would want to go back to being allowed, people smoking on the subway and people smoking on planes? And I remember the doctor used to smoke you while he was used to smoke while he was examining you, right?
Yeah.
Now, even smokers don't want to go back to that. So these changes are always controversial at first, but when you start to see the improvements, people feel differently.
I've been dying to ask you this question since I started asking this question, which is, tell me the one thing that made you think differently.
I mean, so many things have made me
It's your life is this question.
Well, I really believe if you are not changing your mind, you have died, right? You've sort of intellectually and morally died. There's a British intellectual, I won't name him, but a very good writer, who said in an interview not that long ago, I have changed my mind on no significant issue since 1970. I thought, really? Nothing has happened since 1970 that's made you think differently. I mean, that's bizarre to me. I'll give you an example of one that really profoundly affected my life. And I'm very grateful for. So when I was a baby journalist, when I was 22, I went to Iraq. This was when Saddam Hussein was still in power. And obviously it was horrendous, the situation there. And so I was in favour of the American and British invasion of Iraq. And I was very naive about American power, about British power. And there's a British media monitoring group called Media Lens, kind of left-wing group, who sent what I had written to Noam Chomsky, the great intellectual. And he wrote this incredibly withering deconstruction of what I'd said. And at the time, I was really pissed off. I was like, fuck him. And then I noticed over the next year or two, everything Chomsky said turned out to be right, and everything I'd said turned out to be wrong. And I then read lots of... I had read some of his work before, but I read a load of his work. And then I covered the war in the Congo using many of the insights that I'd learned from Chomsky, which is the war in the Congo was the worst war since the Second World War. 6 million people died. Horrific. And I sent what I wrote to Chomsky, and he was coming to London. He said, let's meet up. This is really interesting. And we became friends. And I've actually, for the last 13 years, been researching and writing a biography of him. I'll probably be older than Noam is now by the time I finish, because his life is so complex and it takes so much to research it. But yeah, I sort of think, God, if I'd remained the kind of person who was trapped and defensive about that position that I took when I was 22, I would have missed out on so much insight, so much understanding, so much wisdom from Chomsky. So yeah, one of the great joys of life is that you learn stuff you didn't know, and you get to think differently. To me, it's one of the most precious things about being alive. So you can approach your errors in terror and be in a kind of defensive crouch. And of course, the toxicity of social media environments increase that. Every change of mind is presented as a humiliation or a sign that you were, I don't know, at best you're a hypocrite, I just think extricate yourself from those environments and think in a more open, deep and thoughtful way. And the world is just full of gifts to you if you think that way.
I love it. Johann, thank you so much. The new
Oh,
book
what
is
a pleasure.
called Magic Pill. We've got Stolen Focus, which I still think everybody needs to read. Not that you shouldn't read Chasing the Scream or Lost Connection. Also, just read them all. They're great. Johann, let people know where they can best connect to. I know that you're doing updates with Magic Pill as things evolve as well.
Yes, you can go to magicpillbook.com, or if you want to find out about all my books, you can go to johannhari.com. All my books are available as audiobooks, ebooks, physical books. My publishers give me the script where you're meant to say it's available from all good bookshops, but the truth is you can also buy it from shitty bookshops. We don't have it's not like some quality test where we go, your bookshop's not good enough, mate. So yeah, you can get it everywhere. Well, pleasure. Thanks so much, Mitch. I always enjoy talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Johann.